Mexico is getting out of hand because that's what happens when you have prohibition. You got to understand what occurs when you prohibit a drug. The first thing that occurs is you create an underground market for that particular drug that's instantly filled with criminals. And worse, now that these drugs are dangerous to supply because you can go to prison for life, you can get killed by other drug dealers, you get killed by cops, that creates an artificially inflated value for these drugs, a value that is so huge that between where they're produced mainly in developing countries like Afghanistan or Colombia and where they're sold in Europe or the United States, that value can increase by more than 17,000%. Imagine what kind of obscene profit motive that is. I mean, I learned very early on living out there, 14 years I worked undercover, living with those folks in the street, that if a uniformed police officer arrested somebody for rape, say, or robbery in your community, the rapes and robberies went down, right? You got the guy. But when I arrested someone for drug sales, the drug sales didn't change at all. I was simply creating a job opening for hundreds of more people willing to take the risk.
So the war against drugs is a whole other ball game than the war against the rest other crimes. But what makes you so sure that legalization, is the way to go?
Well, because we've done all this before. In my country, we had alcohol prohibition, the Noble experiment, we called it, and that only lasted 13 years before we realized we can't live with the unintended consequences. The unintended consequences was we raised the rate of murder to the highest level ever recorded in our history to that point, the rate of corruption of public officials and police officers to the highest level. Alcohol poisonings increased by 600% under prohibition. And the day we ended that nasty law in 1933, the next morning Al Capone and all his smuggling buddies were out of business, right? They were off our streets. They were no longer out there killing each other to control that very lucrative market. They were no longer killing us cops charged with fighting that useless war, and they were no longer killing our children who get caught in crossfire and drive-by shooting. So we know if we legalize the drugs, we can end the violence.
But we also know that drugs create lots of addiction. We know that it's not good for your health. Why shouldn't we go ahead and say, this is bad for you, we don't want it?
Because it's not productive to do that. There's not an individual in this 20,000 member organization that I run, LEAP, Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, who wants to see one more drug abuser in the world. We spent our entire adult careers fighting against that, and we haven't changed our mind about that. We've changed our mind about how to go about it. And we know that if we legalize the drugs, the violence is gone, then if we regulate the drugs, wonderful things will happen. We can end overdose deaths. People don't die of an overdose because they shoot more and more dope. They die because they don't know how much of that tiny package of powder they're buying is really the drug and how much is the cutting agent. Too much drug, you're dead. And in an illegal, unregulated market, they will never know.
You are traveling the world and talking to politicians and law enforcement officers about this and convincing them, I believe, to a certain extent. When do you think internationally we will legalize drugs?
Well, I really believe that internationally it'll happen probably around 10 years from now. I'm very, very optimistic. And 7 years ago, when we started this organization, I wasn't. But now we've given 5,500 presentations around the world. And we have the effect of convincing about 80% of our audience. Because our arguments are very cogent, very logical, and the other side doesn't have a leg to stand on. It really doesn't. I think this is going to happen. And you know, it's not simply a coincidence that we ended alcohol prohibition in the United States at the height of the Great Depression. You can't afford prohibition when the economy is going into the tank.
So the financial crisis is good for your point?
It is helpful for us, yeah.
Thank you for talking to us.
You're welcome.
It is